I used to believe the cruelest words were spoken in anger. I was wrong. The cruelest words are often delivered with a smile while everyone else is holding a glass. My grandson Liam's 9th birthday lunch was held at a beautiful country club just outside our small town. Sunlight poured through the tall windows, children laughed around colorful balloons, and soft piano music drifted across the dining room. Every table was decorated with blue and silver centerpieces because Liam had recently become fascinated with rockets and the night sky. Watching him race from one guest to another with the excitement only a child could have made me forget every lonely holiday that had come before. I had spent the entire morning convincing myself that today would be different. Families changed. Hearts softened. At least that was what I wanted to believe. Vanessa greeted arriving guests with polished confidence, making certain every flower arrangement sat perfectly and every place setting matched the seating chart she had carefully organized. My son Daniel followed close behind her, smiling politely as he welcomed relatives, neighbors, and several of Liam's classmates. He looked tired, but I had grown used to seeing that expression. It was the face of a man who spent too much time trying to keep everyone happy and not enough time asking whether anyone was being treated fairly. Liam spotted me the moment I walked through the entrance. He ran across the room and wrapped his arms around my waist before proudly showing me the birthday card he had made at school. Across the front he had drawn a little house beneath a bright yellow sun with stick figures holding hands in the front yard. Above the drawing he had written, "Best Grandma Ever." I kissed the top of his head and slipped a neatly wrapped gift into his hands. His eyes sparkled with curiosity, but his parents reminded him to wait until after lunch before opening presents. He nodded obediently and placed the gift on the long table already filled with colorful packages. I quietly took my seat and looked around the room. My sister Helen smiled warmly from across the table. A few cousins waved. Several neighbors asked about my rose garden. Everything felt ordinary, and for the first time in months I allowed myself to relax. Lunch was served family style. Platters of roasted chicken, fresh vegetables, mashed potatoes, warm dinner rolls, and garden salad were passed from one end of the table to the other. The children laughed over slices of watermelon while the adults exchanged stories about summer vacations and baseball games. Every now and then I caught Liam looking toward the pile of presents with barely contained excitement. Moments like that reminded me why I had quietly helped pay for the celebration weeks earlier. Childhood memories should never carry the weight of adult disagreements. As dessert plates were cleared away, Vanessa stood slowly and picked up her crystal glass. The room gradually became quiet. Conversations faded. Silverware rested against china plates. Everyone turned toward her, expecting the usual birthday wishes for Liam. She smiled brightly before thanking the guests for coming, complimenting the restaurant staff, and talking about how important family traditions were. Then her eyes settled on me. Her smile became just a little sharper. She lifted her glass higher and said, "Would also like to make a special toast to the old lady who is about to spend her last days in a nursing home right after we receive the inheritance." For one endless heartbeat, nobody moved. Then scattered laughter broke the silence. A few people chuckled nervously, unsure whether it was meant to be a joke. Others laughed because everyone else seemed to be laughing. I slowly looked around the table, studying faces I had known for decades. Some avoided my eyes. Others stared down at their plates. Daniel froze with his glass halfway to his lips. He opened his mouth as though he wanted to speak, but no words came. I felt every pair of eyes waiting to see whether I would cry, argue, or leave. Instead, I calmly reached for my own glass. My hands did not shake. My voice remained steady. I smiled softly and raised it toward Vanessa. "Thank you," I said. "I believe every toast deserves another." Confusion quietly replaced amusement around the table. Vanessa's confident expression flickered for the briefest moment before returning. She thought I was surrendering with grace. She believed the story had already reached its ending. She had no idea that the house she was already celebrating had never belonged to the future she imagined, and before this birthday was over, everyone at that table would finally learn why my late husband had always insisted that patience was far more powerful than pride. I did not say another word after lowering my glass. The silence that followed seemed louder than Vanessa's toast had been only moments earlier. She smiled politely at the guests and quickly suggested everyone enjoy dessert before the ice cream melted. The conversations slowly returned, although they sounded different now. Some people spoke more quietly than before. Others avoided looking in my direction altogether. Children continued laughing at the far end of the room, completely unaware that the adults had allowed something far more important than a birthday toast to unfold in front of them. Liam walked over carrying a paper party hat that had slipped over one eye. He grinned and asked if I wanted to help him light the candles later. I smiled warmly and adjusted the hat so he could see again. I told him I would be honored. His innocent excitement reminded me that none of this belonged to him. Children should never become responsible for the failures of adults. 3 weeks earlier, when Vanessa first announced the birthday lunch, she sounded unusually friendly when she called. She explained that Liam wanted the entire family together this year because he was finally old enough to remember every birthday clearly. Her voice carried a warmth I had not heard in months. She asked whether I would be willing to help cover part of the restaurant reservation because the guest list had grown larger than expected. I agreed without hesitation. Celebrating my grandson had never felt like an expense. It felt like a privilege. The following afternoon I visited my favorite bookstore and spent nearly an hour searching for the perfect present. Liam had become fascinated with astronomy after his science teacher organized an evening stargazing event at school. I found a beautifully illustrated book about the solar system along with a beginner's star chart and a quality pair of binoculars designed for children. The young cashier carefully wrapped everything in deep blue paper covered with tiny silver stars. She smiled and said, "Someone is going to have a wonderful birthday." I believed that with all my heart. During the following week I also stopped by the bakery Vanessa had recommended. Since I was already there, I quietly paid the remaining balance for Liam's custom birthday cake after learning there had been an unexpected increase in the final cost. The baker thanked me kindly and mentioned that Vanessa would be relieved because she had seemed worried about staying within budget. I never mentioned the payment afterward. Family celebrations were never supposed to become competitions over who contributed more. Looking back, I realized I had quietly solved problems that nobody even knew existed. At the time, I was simply trying to make my grandson smile. 2 days before the celebration, I called Daniel to ask whether Liam needed anything else. He sounded distracted but thanked me for everything I had already done. Before ending the conversation, he hesitated for a moment and then asked if I planned to arrive a little early. I answered yes because I always liked helping before guests arrived. There was another brief silence before he quietly replied that Vanessa had already arranged everything with the restaurant staff and that I should simply come at the scheduled time. I thought very little of it then. Now, sitting at the birthday table after hearing her cruel toast, that small conversation returned to me with surprising clarity. It was another tiny piece of a puzzle that had been quietly forming for much longer than I realized. As coffee was served, I noticed several relatives glancing toward me before quickly looking away whenever our eyes met. My cousin Margaret reached over and gently squeezed my hand beneath the table without saying a word. That simple gesture meant more than she probably realized. Kindness often spoke most clearly when it remained quiet. Vanessa moved confidently from table to table thanking guests for attending, laughing easily and accepting compliments about the beautiful luncheon. To anyone walking into the room at that moment, everything appeared perfect. Yet perfection built upon humiliation never remained perfect for very long. I slowly unfolded my cloth napkin and placed it neatly beside my dessert plate. Inside my handbag rested a small cream-colored envelope that had accompanied a birthday card my late husband had asked me never to ignore if certain circumstances ever arose. I had not planned to think about it that afternoon. In truth, I had hoped I would never need it at all. But as I watched Vanessa accept congratulations while speaking casually about family traditions and the future, I realized Thomas had understood something years before I ever did. Some people celebrated victories long before they knew who had truly won. I gently rested my hand on my handbag without opening it. There would be a proper moment for everything. Patience had carried me through nearly 7 decades of life, and it had never failed me yet. Around the room, birthday candles were finally placed on Liam's cake as the lights dimmed slightly. Everyone smiled toward my grandson, believing the afternoon was returning to normal. They had no idea that the most important part of the celebration had not happened yet, and that the quiet envelope resting only inches from my hand contained a truth capable of changing the meaning of every word spoken around that table. I watched Liam close his eyes and make a wish before blowing out the candles while everyone applauded with cheerful smiles. For a few precious seconds, the uncomfortable toast seemed to disappear beneath the sound of children's laughter. I focused on my grandson instead of the adults around him because I refused to let anyone steal that memory from him. He laughed as his friends crowded around the cake, arguing over who would receive the biggest slice. Watching him reminded me of Daniel when he was the same age. He had always smiled with his entire face, never worrying about tomorrow because he trusted the people who loved him. Somewhere between childhood and adulthood, that trust had become silence. As plates of birthday cake were passed around the room, my thoughts quietly drifted backward through the years. The birthday lunch had not been the beginning of my exclusion. It had simply been the first time someone decided to announce it publicly. I remembered the Christmas dinner 2 years earlier when everyone exchanged matching family sweaters for a group photograph. Mine had somehow never been ordered. Vanessa laughed politely and said the store must have made a mistake. I smiled and wore my old cardigan instead because I did not want to ruin the evening. The following summer the family planned a week at a lakeside cabin. I discovered the trip only after Liam accidentally mentioned fishing with his parents and cousins. Daniel apologized and blamed a last-minute reservation change that supposedly reduced the number of available bedrooms. I accepted the explanation because mothers often chose peace over suspicion. Then came Thanksgiving. Vanessa announced she wanted a smaller gathering with only immediate family to simplify hosting responsibilities. 2 days later my sister unknowingly showed me photographs online of nearly 20 relatives seated around the dining table. I was the only one missing. Daniel called afterward and insisted everything had happened too quickly to explain. I accepted that explanation too. Looking back, every excuse sounded different by itself, but together they formed the same quiet sentence. You are no longer part of this family. The saddest part was that nobody ever actually spoke those words. They simply arranged life in a way that allowed me to understand them without hearing them. I often wondered whether Daniel recognized the pattern or whether he had become so accustomed to avoiding difficult conversations that he stopped noticing what was happening. My late husband Thomas used to tell me that habits were built one decision at a time. Courage worked the same way. Every moment we remained silent made the next moment of silence easier. Perhaps that was what had happened to my son. I never believed Daniel was cruel. I believed he became comfortable believing whatever explanation required the least confrontation. Across the dining room, Vanessa laughed as one of the restaurant servers complimented the beautiful decorations. She accepted the praise gracefully, thanking everyone who had helped organize such a memorable afternoon. Hearing those words reminded me of another quiet moment only a week before the celebration. The event coordinator had called my home by mistake, thinking she was speaking with Vanessa because my telephone number remained listed as the secondary contact after I helped reserve the private dining room. She thanked me for promptly covering the final reservation balance and confirmed that every remaining detail had been completed. I politely corrected the misunderstanding and wished her a pleasant afternoon. I never mentioned the conversation afterward because I assumed Vanessa would eventually tell everyone herself. She never did. Recognition never seemed important to me. Respect always mattered much more. As I looked around the restaurant, I realized respect had slowly disappeared long before gratitude did. Helen caught my eye from across the table and gave me a reassuring smile. She had always possessed an unusual ability to read my thoughts without hearing them spoken aloud. When everyone became distracted watching Liam open gifts, she quietly walked over and stood beside my chair. In a voice barely above a whisper, she asked whether I was all right. I answered honestly. I told her I felt calmer than I had expected. She looked surprised until I gently rested one hand on my handbag. I did not remove the cream-colored envelope, but I knew it remained safely inside. Helen glanced at the bag before looking back at me with curious eyes. She did not ask another question. She simply nodded, squeezed my shoulder, and returned to her seat. That small exchange reminded me that not every family member had chosen silence. Some simply trusted that I would know when the time had finally come to speak. Across the room, Liam carefully unwrapped each birthday present with the joyful concentration only children possess. When he opened the astronomy book and binoculars I had chosen weeks earlier, his face lit up with genuine excitement. He hurried across the room and hugged me tightly before thanking me in front of everyone. For a brief moment the entire dining room became quiet again. Vanessa smiled politely, but I noticed the expression never reached her eyes. She believed the afternoon belonged to her because she had controlled every conversation so far. What she did not understand was that truth never depended on who spoke first. Sometimes it waited patiently until everyone had finished celebrating the wrong victory before quietly stepping into the light. I stayed until the last child had opened a present and every plate had been cleared from the tables. The restaurant staff quietly gathered decorations while families lingered over coffee and conversation. From the outside, the afternoon looked exactly like the successful birthday celebration Vanessa had carefully planned. Inside my heart, however, something had settled into place with unexpected clarity. I was no longer trying to convince myself that the hurtful moments of the past had been misunderstandings. The toast had removed every remaining doubt. When the last guests began collecting their coats, Vanessa walked from table to table thanking everyone for coming. She laughed easily, complimented the children on their manners, and accepted praise for organizing such a beautiful event. More than once I heard someone remark that she had thought of every detail. I quietly smiled to myself because I knew something she did not. The most important detail had never belonged to her. As Liam hugged each guest goodbye, he eventually reached me and whispered that he wanted to visit my house soon so we could use the binoculars together after sunset. I kissed his forehead and promised we would look for Jupiter as soon as the weather cleared. His excitement reminded me that the future still contained moments worth protecting. Whatever happened between the adults, I refused to allow bitterness to reach him. Daniel finally approached me while everyone else became busy gathering gifts and leftover cake. He looked uncomfortable, shifting his weight from one foot to the other before quietly apologizing for Vanessa's toast. He insisted she had only been trying to make a joke and admitted it had gone much too far. I listened without interrupting. Then I asked him a simple question. I asked whether he had laughed because he believed it was funny or because remaining silent had become easier than speaking. He lowered his eyes immediately. The answer was already written across his face long before he attempted to find the words. After several moments he admitted he should have stopped her the instant she began speaking. I gently nodded. I told him there was a difference between making a mistake and allowing a pattern to continue. He looked at me with quiet sadness before promising we would talk again soon. I believed he meant it. Whether he possessed the courage to follow through remained another question entirely. As I prepared to leave, I noticed Vanessa standing near the restaurant entrance speaking with the event manager. She smiled confidently while discussing future family celebrations, mentioning anniversaries, holiday gatherings, and even next year's birthday plans. Hearing those words reminded me of another conversation Thomas and I had shared only months before his passing. One evening we sat together on our front porch watching the sun disappear behind the maple trees. Without warning, he asked whether I would promise him something if he was ever gone before me. I laughed and told him he was talking nonsense because he planned to outlive us all. He smiled in that patient way only he could manage and repeated the question. When I agreed, he told me never to confuse kindness with surrender. He said that loving people did not require pretending they were always right. Sometimes protecting a family meant allowing the truth to become visible, even when that truth made everyone uncomfortable. At the time I thought he was simply sharing another piece of ordinary wisdom. Standing inside the restaurant years later, I finally understood why he had chosen those exact words. Thomas had seen changes in our family long before I allowed myself to acknowledge them. As I reached my car, I opened the passenger door and placed my handbag carefully on the seat beside me. Before starting the engine, I removed the small cream-colored envelope and held it quietly in both hands. The paper had yellowed slightly with age, but Thomas's neat handwriting remained unmistakable. Across the front he had written only one sentence. For Eleanor. Open this when respect is no longer enough to protect your place in the family. I closed my eyes for a moment before gently tracing each letter with my fingertips. This was not an envelope filled with revenge. Thomas had never believed revenge healed anything. If he had prepared these pages so many years earlier, it was because he wanted truth to stand where emotion could not. I carefully returned the envelope to my handbag without opening it there in the parking lot. Some moments deserve patience. Others demanded the right witness. As I drove away from the country club, the afternoon sunlight stretched across the quiet road ahead of me. Behind me, everyone believed the celebration had already ended. They believed the final toast had been spoken and the future of our family had already been decided. None of them realized that the only words capable of changing everything had not yet been read, and the promise my husband left behind was finally about to fulfill the purpose he had entrusted to me many years before. Early the next morning I placed the cream-colored envelope on my kitchen table beside a cup of untouched coffee. For several minutes I simply looked at Thomas's familiar handwriting, remembering the steady confidence that had guided our family through every difficult season of our marriage. He had never been a man who acted out of fear. If he prepared something to be opened only under very specific circumstances, there had been a reason. I carefully broke the seal and unfolded the neatly written pages inside. The first page was a personal letter addressed to me. Thomas thanked me for the years we had built together, for raising Daniel with patience, and for never allowing temporary disappointments to change the kind of person I chose to be. Then his words became more serious. He explained that during the final years of his life he had noticed subtle changes within the family. He had watched conversations become more focused on possessions than relationships. He had seen kindness slowly replaced by entitlement. Most importantly, he had recognized that our home was beginning to mean different things to different people. To me, it represented decades of memories. To Liam, it was the place where he learned to ride his bicycle and bake cookies on rainy afternoons. To someone else, it might eventually become nothing more than a valuable piece of property. Thomas wrote that he hoped he was mistaken, but if I ever opened the letter, it would mean his concerns had become reality. Attached behind the letter was a business card for Richard Collins, the attorney who had handled every important legal matter for our family over the past 20 years. Beneath the card Thomas had written one sentence in blue ink. Richard knows everything. Trust him when the time comes. I picked up the telephone that afternoon and called Richard's office. His assistant transferred me immediately after I introduced myself. When Richard heard my voice, he became quiet for a moment before gently asking whether I had finally opened the envelope. I answered yes. He did not sound surprised. Instead, he asked whether I could meet him the following morning. His calm tone reassured me that Thomas had indeed planned carefully for this possibility. The next day I drove to Richard's office in the center of town. The building was familiar because Thomas and I had visited several times over the years while updating routine documents. Richard welcomed me warmly and invited me into his conference room. After expressing his sympathy once again for Thomas's passing, he opened a thick file bearing our family name. He explained that Thomas had created a carefully structured estate plan designed not only to distribute assets but also to protect the purpose behind them. Richard emphasized that Thomas believed wealth should strengthen a family rather than divide it. He slowly turned several pages before stopping at a document that immediately caught my attention. It clearly showed that the family home had been transferred into a trust years before Thomas passed away. I listened carefully as Richard explained that the trust contained detailed instructions regarding ownership, occupancy, and future inheritance. Nothing about the arrangement was unusual from a legal perspective, but Thomas had included several personal conditions reflecting his deepest values. Richard smiled gently and said Thomas often reminded him that a house was never just wood, brick, and paint. It represented stability, respect, and the promise that every generation should leave something better for the next. Richard did not hand me every document that morning. Instead, he suggested we wait until the appropriate moment before sharing the complete file with the rest of the family. He believed the timing mattered because facts delivered too early often became arguments, while facts delivered at the right moment became clarity. I found myself agreeing with him. Before leaving, I placed Thomas's letter back inside the envelope and thanked Richard for honoring my husband's wishes with such care. As I walked toward my car, my telephone vibrated. It was a cheerful message from Vanessa in the family group chat announcing that everyone should gather at our house the following weekend to discuss future plans after such a wonderful birthday celebration. She ended the message by writing that it was finally time for the family to start thinking ahead. I read the words twice before quietly placing my telephone back into my purse. Vanessa believed she was inviting everyone to plan the future. She did not yet understand that Thomas had already planned far beyond anything she could imagine, and the truth waiting inside Richard's office would soon change every assumption that had guided her confidence. The following Saturday arrived with bright sunshine and unusually cool air for late summer. I drove to the family house a few minutes early, not because I wanted an advantage, but because I wanted a few quiet moments before everyone else arrived. The old maple tree still shaded the front yard exactly as it had when Thomas planted it decades earlier. Every branch seemed to hold another memory. Daniel learning to throw a baseball. Liam chasing bubbles across the lawn. Holiday photographs filled with genuine laughter. I stood there for a moment before walking inside, reminding myself that no document could replace those memories, but perhaps it could protect the values behind them. Vanessa greeted me with surprising warmth, offering coffee and complimenting the flowers I had brought for the dining room table. Her friendliness felt carefully rehearsed. She spoke enthusiastically about renovation ideas, property values, and how wonderful it would be for the family to have a fresh start in the future. Every sentence seemed to assume that the future had already been decided. Daniel remained unusually quiet, occasionally glancing toward me before looking away again. I could tell he had not forgotten our conversation after Liam's birthday lunch. The weight of his silence appeared heavier than before. Liam ran into the room carrying the astronomy book I had given him and excitedly announced that he had already memorized the names of several constellations. He asked whether we could use the binoculars that evening if the sky remained clear. I smiled and promised we would look for Saturn together. His excitement briefly softened the atmosphere, reminding everyone that family moments should never revolve around legal discussions. Once everyone had settled into the living room, Vanessa gently cleared her throat and suggested it was time to discuss long-term plans for the house. She explained that maintaining an older property required significant expense and hinted that selling it someday might be the most practical decision. She spoke confidently about market prices, neighborhood demand, and future investments. Although she never directly claimed ownership, every sentence suggested she believed that outcome was inevitable. Daniel listened without interrupting. I watched him carefully. Several times he seemed ready to speak, only to hesitate once more. When Vanessa finished, she looked toward me with a polite smile and asked whether I had given any thought to moving somewhere smaller where I would have fewer responsibilities. Her tone remained pleasant, but the meaning beneath her words was unmistakable. I answered calmly that I had indeed spent many days thinking about the future. I told her that Thomas had encouraged me to prepare carefully for moments exactly like this. Her confident expression changed ever so slightly. Before she could respond, the doorbell rang. Daniel walked to the front entrance and returned moments later with Richard Collins. Vanessa looked surprised because she had not expected anyone else to attend. Richard greeted everyone courteously before shaking my hand. He carried a slim leather portfolio under one arm and thanked the family for allowing him a few minutes to clarify several matters that Thomas had asked him to address when the appropriate time arrived. The room became noticeably quieter. Richard explained that he was not there to create conflict but to prevent misunderstanding. He believed Thomas valued openness above assumption. Vanessa attempted a light laugh and remarked that legal paperwork could surely wait for another day because everyone already understood what Thomas would have wanted. Richard smiled politely but replied that Thomas had preferred written instructions over guesswork. Those simple words settled heavily across the room. Daniel slowly leaned forward, giving Richard his complete attention for the first time that afternoon. I remained silent, allowing events to unfold exactly as Thomas had hoped. Richard opened his portfolio with calm precision and carefully arranged several documents on the coffee table without revealing every page immediately. He first reviewed the timeline showing when Thomas had established the trust years before his illness. He explained that every signature had been properly witnessed and every amendment legally recorded. Nothing had been rushed or added after Thomas became ill. Everything reflected deliberate decisions made while he was healthy and fully informed. Vanessa's confident posture gradually disappeared. She exchanged a quick glance with Daniel, searching for reassurance that did not come. Richard then looked directly at me before saying that Thomas had left one final instruction regarding the family home, an instruction he believed everyone deserved to hear together. The room fell completely silent. Even Liam instinctively lowered his voice and moved closer to me, sensing that something important was about to happen. As Richard reached for the final sealed document, I realized the moment Thomas had prepared for years earlier had finally arrived, and within the next few minutes every assumption surrounding our family's future would be measured against the truth he had carefully protected all along. Richard carefully unfolded the final document and looked around the room before speaking. His voice remained calm, measured, and free of emotion, allowing the words themselves to carry their weight. He explained that Thomas had established the family trust nearly 6 years before his passing and that the house had been transferred into that trust immediately afterward. Every legal requirement had been completed, every signature witnessed, and every amendment properly recorded. Nothing about the arrangement had been left to chance. Vanessa leaned forward, forcing a polite smile as though she expected the explanation to confirm everything she had assumed. Instead, Richard continued by reading Thomas's written statement. Thomas explained that the family home would never become the personal property of any individual simply because of inheritance. It would remain protected by the trust unless very specific conditions were met. The first condition required that the surviving spouse, meaning me, would have the unrestricted right to live in the home for the remainder of my life without interference or pressure from any beneficiary. The second condition stated that no beneficiary could force the sale of the property while I remained alive. The third condition surprised everyone in the room. Thomas had written that any heir who attempted to pressure, manipulate, or publicly humiliate another family member for financial advantage could have his or her interest reviewed by the trustee before any future distribution. Richard carefully placed the document on the coffee table and allowed several quiet seconds to pass. Nobody spoke. Daniel slowly looked toward me, then toward Vanessa, as though replaying every conversation from the past several years inside his mind. Vanessa finally broke the silence. She insisted that Thomas could not possibly have anticipated every future disagreement and suggested that the language sounded overly broad. Richard acknowledged her concern respectfully before explaining that Thomas had intentionally included those provisions after lengthy discussions about preserving family harmony. He also explained that the trustee had discretion only after reviewing documented evidence rather than personal opinions. This was not punishment. It was protection. My husband had wanted the values behind the home preserved as carefully as the property itself. Daniel quietly asked whether I had known about the trust all along. I answered honestly. I told him I had only learned the complete details after opening Thomas's letter following Liam's birthday celebration. I explained that I had never wanted a legal document to settle a family disagreement. I had hoped respect alone would always be enough. Richard nodded gently, confirming that Thomas had instructed him not to reveal the trust unless circumstances clearly demonstrated that his concerns had become reality. Liam looked from one adult to another, obviously confused by the legal discussion. I smiled softly and told him none of this changed the promise we had made to watch the stars together that evening. He smiled back with the simple trust only a child possesses, and that small moment reminded me why Thomas had worked so hard to protect the future rather than merely divide possessions. Vanessa lowered her eyes for the first time since the conversation began. The confidence that had filled her voice during the birthday luncheon had disappeared. She admitted that she had assumed the house would naturally become Daniel's after my passing and that she had allowed those expectations to influence the way she viewed the future. Daniel took a slow breath before quietly saying that assumptions had led them far away from the family they wanted to be. His words were not dramatic, but they were sincere. Richard gathered the remaining papers and reminded everyone that legal documents could determine ownership, but they could never create trust or repair relationships. Those responsibilities belonged to the family itself. As the meeting came to an end, sunlight streamed through the living room windows, illuminating the framed photographs Thomas had loved so much. Looking at those pictures, I realized the greatest gift he had left behind was not the trust itself. It was the opportunity for each of us to decide what kind of family we would become once the truth had finally been placed in front of us. The house felt unusually quiet after Richard left. No one hurried toward the door. No one reached for another argument. The legal documents had answered the questions about ownership, but they had also uncovered something much more difficult to face. They had revealed the distance that had quietly grown between us over the years. Vanessa remained seated on the edge of the sofa, staring at the coffee table where the trust documents had rested only moments before. The confidence that had once filled every sentence she spoke had disappeared, replaced by a thoughtful silence. Daniel finally broke the stillness. He looked toward me with tired eyes and admitted that he had spent far too many years convincing himself that avoiding conflict was the same as keeping peace. He realized now that every moment he chose silence, someone else had carried the weight alone. I appreciated his honesty because genuine change always began with truth instead of excuses. Before I could answer, Vanessa quietly stood and walked toward the family photographs displayed along the living room wall. She stopped in front of a picture taken nearly 10 years earlier. Thomas stood beside me with one arm around Daniel while little Liam sat on his grandfather's shoulders laughing at something beyond the camera. Vanessa studied the photograph for several seconds before speaking. She admitted she had spent so much time planning for a future she imagined that she had forgotten to appreciate the family already standing beside her. She did not ask for immediate forgiveness. Instead, she simply apologized for allowing pride and assumptions to shape her decisions. Her voice was steady, but I could hear genuine regret beneath every word. I answered gently that apologies mattered most when they became actions rather than memories. Trust could not be rebuilt in a single afternoon, but every family received opportunities to begin again if everyone chose the same direction. Liam wandered back into the room carrying the astronomy book under one arm and the binoculars in the other. He smiled brightly and asked whether everyone wanted to watch the sunset before looking for the first stars. None of us could help smiling. Children often reminded adults how simple important things could be. We carried lawn chairs into the backyard where Thomas had spent countless evenings teaching Daniel the names of constellations. The maple tree swayed gently in the evening breeze while the last golden sunlight settled across the grass. Liam eagerly searched the sky through his binoculars, announcing every airplane as though it were a newly discovered planet. Daniel laughed for the first time that day, and even Vanessa smiled as Liam proudly corrected himself after realizing the difference between an airplane and a bright evening star. Watching them together, I understood what Thomas had truly protected. It had never been only the house. It had been the possibility that this family might one day remember how to sit together without measuring one another by possessions, expectations, or inheritance. As darkness slowly covered the sky, Liam pointed excitedly toward a bright object rising above the trees. I adjusted the binoculars for him and showed him Saturn glowing faintly against the deep blue horizon. His face lit up with amazement. He whispered that Grandpa would have loved seeing it. I placed my hand gently on his shoulder and told him I believed Grandpa probably did. No one spoke for several moments. The silence no longer felt uncomfortable. It felt peaceful. Daniel quietly thanked me for staying instead of walking away after everything that had happened. I told him families were not strengthened by pretending painful moments never occurred. They became stronger when people chose to learn from them together. Vanessa nodded in quiet agreement. She offered to help preserve the traditions Thomas had cherished instead of replacing them with her own ideas. It was a small promise, but it sounded sincere. Looking across the backyard, I realized the greatest inheritance Thomas had left us was not written inside legal documents. It was the reminder that respect must always come before ownership, and love must always come before pride. The stars continued appearing one by one above the old maple tree, and for the first time in a very long while, the future no longer felt like something to fear. It felt like something our family could earn together, one honest choice at a time. Several months passed more quickly than I expected. Autumn slowly painted the maple tree outside the family home with shades of gold and crimson, and life settled into a quieter rhythm. The legal documents were eventually placed back into Richard's office, where they belonged. They had served their purpose. They had not solved every problem, but they had removed every misunderstanding. From that point forward, each member of the family faced a choice that no attorney could make. We could continue measuring one another by past mistakes, or we could begin earning trust one day at a time. Daniel chose the more difficult path. He visited every weekend, sometimes alone and sometimes with Liam. We spent long afternoons repairing small things around the house that Thomas had once promised to fix. While we worked, we talked more honestly than we had in years. There were uncomfortable conversations about missed holidays, unanswered telephone calls, and moments when silence had become easier than courage. Daniel never tried to excuse those choices. Instead, he accepted responsibility for them, and that simple honesty accomplished more than perfect words ever could. Vanessa changed more gradually. She understood that rebuilding confidence required patience rather than promises. She stopped speaking about the house altogether. Instead, she asked questions about Thomas, about the traditions we had started when Daniel was a little boy, and about recipes that had been served at every family Thanksgiving. One afternoon she quietly admitted that she had spent so much energy trying to create the perfect future that she had forgotten to appreciate the people standing beside her in the present. I thanked her for saying it aloud because acknowledging a mistake often required more strength than defending one. Liam remained blissfully untouched by the legal complications that had occupied the adults. To him, the house continued to be the place where homemade cookies cooled on the kitchen counter, where old family photographs filled every hallway, and where the backyard offered the clearest view of the evening sky. We kept our promise to watch the stars together whenever the weather allowed. Each new constellation reminded me that some things remained dependable no matter how complicated life became. During the first family Thanksgiving after Liam's birthday, everyone gathered around the same dining table Thomas had built with his own hands many years earlier. As I arranged the plates, I noticed something that made me smile. Nobody worried about where anyone should sit. Chairs were simply pulled closer together whenever another family member arrived. The conversation flowed naturally, filled with stories, laughter, and memories instead of quiet competition. Before dinner began, Daniel surprised everyone by standing to offer a toast. He looked first toward Liam, then toward Vanessa, and finally toward me. He thanked every person at the table for choosing honesty over pride and forgiveness over resentment. He admitted that a family could survive disappointment only when its members were willing to listen as carefully as they expected to be heard. When he finished speaking, he raised his glass toward me. This time there was no uncomfortable silence. There was only quiet respect shared by everyone around the table. I lifted my own glass and smiled. I told them that Thomas had once said a house became a home because of the people who protected one another inside it. Bricks could shelter us from rain. Love sheltered us from loneliness. That was the inheritance worth preserving. As evening settled outside, Liam asked whether we could step into the backyard before dessert to look for Saturn once again. We all walked outside together. Standing beneath the old maple tree, I looked at the familiar windows glowing with warm light and realized that nothing truly valuable had ever belonged to me alone. The greatest gift was seeing the next generation learn that respect could never be inherited, purchased, or demanded. It had to be earned through countless ordinary choices made with kindness and integrity. I thought back to that painful birthday lunch when one careless toast had exposed everything that had been quietly hidden beneath polite smiles. At the time it felt like the end of something precious. Looking at my family gathered together beneath the evening sky, I understood it had actually been the beginning of something far better. Truth had not divided us. It had given us the chance to become the family Thomas had always believed we could be. And as the first stars appeared above the quiet neighborhood, I silently thanked him for leaving behind far more than a home. He had left us a reason to become better people, and that legacy would endure long after every legal document had faded into history.